4 days. That's how long Betty Brown had been stitching her own pride back together while her body fell apart in secret. 4 days since Marcus Sterling, the head of operations who thought power meant ownership, had cornered her in a dark stairwell and beaten her until breathing felt like swallowing glass. 4 days of layering concealer over split skin, binding her ribs with medical tape scavenged from a CVS first aid kit, and downing ibuprofen like water just to survive the elevator ride to the 42nd floor because she couldn't afford to show weakness, couldn't afford to give them a reason to call her fragile, couldn't afford to prove every whispered doubt about her right. But the body keeps score, and pride can't stop internal bleeding. And on the 4th day, in the middle of a $50 million acquisition presentation, surrounded by board members and investors, Betty Brown's body made the choice her mind refused to make. She collapsed. But she didn't shatter against the marble floor because hands, tattooed, powerful, belonging to the most feared man in the financial district, caught her before gravity could finish what Marcus started. Tain Chen, CEO, billionaire, and the Chinese triad boss who controlled more than spreadsheets in this building. The man everyone whispered about. The man who looked at Betty's torn blouse, at the blood seeping through her cream blazer, and made a decision that would burn the corporate world to ash. Some women get rescued by heroes. Betty got claimed by a dragon. And sometimes that's exactly what justice looks like. Before we dive into how one woman's refusal to break became the spark that ignited the most dangerous protection in New York, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Because this story is about survival, vengeance, and the razor-thin line between being saved and being owned. Okay, pause for a second. I need to know something. Where are you right now? What are you doing while you're listening to this? Because I'm imagining some of you are folding laundry, some are pretending to work, and at least one person is listening to this in the bathroom. If that's your respect, no shame here. Leave a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you're invested in watching Shauna absolutely demolish everyone who wronged her, do me a favor, hit like and subscribe. More stories like this are coming, and you're not going to want to miss them. All right, let's get back to it. Chen Holdings occupied a gleaming 58-story monument to power in Lower Manhattan. From street level, it looked like any other financial fortress. Titanium and tempered glass, a lobby decorated with Ming Dynasty artifacts, security personnel who moved with military precision. But everyone who worked there understood the truth. Chen Holdings wasn't just an investment empire. It was the legitimate face of the most sophisticated Chinese criminal network on the eastern seaboard. And the man at the summit, Tain Chen, wasn't just a CEO. He was the dragon of Wall Street, a man whose handshake could make or destroy fortunes, whose disapproval meant disappearance, whose very name made powerful men choose their words carefully. Betty Brown had worked at Chen Holdings for 3 years as a senior financial strategist in the Mergers and Acquisitions division. She was 29 years old, Black American, 57, with rich brown skin, natural hair she wore in meticulously maintained locks pulled into a professional low bun, and sharp dark eyes that could dissect a balance sheet in minutes. She was exceptional at her job, transforming complex financial models into acquisition strategies that had generated over $200 million in value for the company. But she kept her head down, maintained professional distance, never drew unnecessary attention to herself. Because in a place like Chen Holdings, invisibility was armor, especially for a woman, especially for a Black woman in a company built on hierarchies where mercy was a foreign concept. For 3 years, her strategy had been flawless, until Marcus Sterling decided she owed him something she'd never offered. Marcus Sterling was the head of operations, 46 years old, white, competent enough to be useful but arrogant enough to be dangerous, and untouchable because his family's law firm had represented the Chen Empire for 2 generations. He had been circling Betty for months. Compliments that felt like threats, touches that lasted a heartbeat too long, invitations to private dinners that she declined with surgical politeness. 3 weeks ago, he'd cornered her at the executive retreat. "You know," he'd said, blocking her path on the terrace, "women like you usually understand how things work at this level. Loyalty, gratitude, reciprocity." "I show my gratitude through my work, Mr. Sterling," Betty had replied, her voice steady even as her pulse spiked. My quarterly reports speak for themselves. That's not the kind of reciprocity I'm talking about. His smile had been predatory. You're smart enough to know that talent only gets you so far. The right connections get you the rest. Then I'll rely on my talent. She'd stepped around him, every muscle tense. Excuse me. She'd filed a formal complaint with HR the following Monday. The HR director, a man named Gerald who'd been with Chen Holdings since its founding, had reviewed her documentation with the kind of detached interest reserved for quarterly tax filings. I understand your discomfort, Gerald had said, fingers steepled. But Marcus Sterling is a crucial member of our executive leadership. He has a stellar record spanning 12 years. Are you certain you're not overinterpreting professional mentorship? He cornered me and suggested I exchange sexual favors for career advancement. That's not mentorship. Do you have witnesses? No, but I have a pattern of. Then it's a he said, she said situation. And frankly, Ms. Brown, making unsubstantiated accusations against a senior executive could be seen as a liability. We value discretion here. The message was crystalline: silence or consequences. Betty had left that office burning with rage and calculating her options. But she didn't stay silent. She documented everything, created encrypted backups of every inappropriate email, built a timeline with precision that would make prosecutors jealous. Because eventually, somehow, she would make Marcus Sterling answer for every boundary he'd violated. She just didn't know it would happen 4 days later, when her body refused to carry her secrets anymore. It happened on a Tuesday evening. Betty was working late, not unusual for someone who used work as both shield and sanctuary. Betty Brown understood numbers the way some people understood music. She could look at a company's financial statements and hear the melody of profit margins, the rhythm of cash flow, the dissonance of creative accounting meant to hide rot. It was a gift that had carried her from a basement apartment in Baltimore to the 42nd floor of Chen Holdings, where her office overlooked the Hudson River and her quarterly bonuses exceeded what her mother made in a year. 3 years of 70-hour weeks, of turning impossible acquisitions into inevitable victories, of being the smartest person in rooms full of men who'd gone to schools she couldn't afford. 3 years of perfection, because anything less than flawless gave them permission to say she didn't belong. The glass ceiling at Chen Holdings wasn't invisible. It was crystalline, deliberate, maintained with the same precision as the balance sheets Betty mastered. She watched white men with half her talent get promoted to VP while she remained senior strategist. Watched them take credit for her models in board meetings while she sat silent in the corner. Watched the way Tane Chen's inner circle remained exclusively male despite his supposed meritocracy. But Betty had learned patience. Document everything. Outwork everyone. Wait for the moment when her value became undeniable. Marcus Sterling had other ideas about her value. It started small, a hand on her lower back during an elevator ride. Comments about how exotic her locks looked when she wore them down. Emails sent at midnight asking if she was still awake, still working, still alone. Betty ignored them with the same cold precision she applied to hostile negotiations. Professional distance, paper trail, HR on speed dial. But Marcus had been at Chen Holdings for 12 years, had family connections that reached back to the empire's founding, had the kind of institutional protection that made him bold. The boldness escalated. He started appearing outside her office at the end of the day, offering rides home she never accepted. He scheduled unnecessary one-on-one meetings in conference rooms far from foot traffic. He began touching her arm during presentations, his fingers lingering just long enough to make his intentions clear. And when Betty finally confronted him in the parking garage, asking him directly to stop, Marcus had smiled like she'd told a joke. You really think anyone's going to choose you over me? He'd said, that predatory amusement making her skin crawl. You're talented, I'll give you that, but talent without protection is just a liability waiting to happen. Think about that, Betty. Think about what I could do for your career, or to it. She'd filed the HR complaint the next morning. Gerald's response had been predictable, scripted, designed to protect the institution rather than the employee. And Marcus, emboldened by that institutional blessing, had followed her into the stairwell 3 days later and shown her exactly what happened to women who said no to men the company valued more. Now, 4 days after that stairwell, Betty sat at her desk reviewing acquisition models while her ribs screamed and her vision blurred. Because the glass ceiling might be unbreakable, but Betty Brown refused to shatter first. The emergency stairwell on the 38th floor was supposed to be for fires and evacuation drills. Betty had used it exactly twice in 3 years, both times during building-wide tests. On Tuesday at 9:47 p.m., it became the place where Marcus Sterling decided to teach her what happened to women who embarrassed him. She'd been leaving late, as usual, her arms full of acquisition folders that needed review before Thursday's presentation. The elevator had been taking too long, so she'd opted for the stairs, planning to walk down 4 floors to clear her head. Marcus had been waiting on the landing between 38 and 37, and the moment Betty saw him there, saw the deliberate way he was blocking the descent, she knew HR's dismissal had been his permission. "We need to talk about your complaint," he'd said, his voice echoing off concrete walls designed to contain sound. No cameras here, no witnesses, just fluorescent lights that flickered and the kind of architectural isolation that made corporate buildings perfect for things that needed to stay invisible. "There's nothing to discuss. I've said everything through proper channels." Betty had kept her voice level, her hand already reaching for her phone. "Proper channels," Marcus had laughed, a sound that made her spine lock. "You really thought Gerald was going to side with you? You really thought anyone in this building was going to choose some affirmative action hire over a legacy employee?" Betty had tried to move past him, had tried to use the self-defense training she'd paid for but never thought she'd need. But Marcus had 80 pounds on her, and the kind of rage that comes from entitlement denied. The first blow had caught her in the ribs, driving the air from her lungs. The second had split her lip when she'd tried to scream. The third, fourth, fifth had blurred together into a symphony of pain, while Marcus hissed about respect and knowing her place, and what happens to ungrateful bitches who don't understand the game. Her folders had scattered across the landing like wounded birds. Her phone had skittered under the stairwell railing, forever out of reach. And when Marcus had finally stepped over her crumpled body and descended the stairs whistling, Betty had lain there for 17 minutes before she could breathe without sobbing. She didn't go to the hospital. Hospitals meant police reports, meant investigations that would force Chen Holdings to choose between her and Marcus, meant professional suicide dressed as justice. She didn't go home where her mother would see and demand answers Betty couldn't afford to give. Instead, she'd driven to an all-night CVS in Queens, bought medical tape and butterfly bandages and the strongest painkillers she could get without a prescription, and stitched herself back together in a public restroom that smelled like bleach and desperation. 4 days. That's how long she'd been carrying the evidence of Marcus Sterling's lesson carved into her skin, hidden under professional armor, while she waited for her body to either heal or betray her. On Thursday morning, standing in front of the boardroom, it finally made its choice. The boardroom on the 45th floor was all glass and steel, and the kind of minimalist luxury that screamed power. 16 executives sat around a table worth more than Betty's annual salary, their attention fixed on the presentation she'd spent 3 weeks perfecting. The Meridian acquisition, $50 million. Her strategy could save Chen Holdings 8 figures in redundancy costs. This was supposed to be her moment of undeniability. Betty stood at the head of the table, her cream blazer hiding the medical tape wrapped around her ribs, her concealer masking the bruises that had bloomed from purple to that sickly yellow-green of healing trauma. She'd taken 4 ibuprofen before the meeting, knew it wasn't enough, knew nothing was enough anymore but couldn't afford to know that. Not here. Not in front of Marcus Sterling, who sat 3 seats down wearing a smile that said he owned her silence. "The synergy analysis shows a 34% operational overlap," Betty said, her voice steady even as her vision started to narrow at the edges. "By consolidating the logistics divisions, we eliminate." Pain lanced through her side, sharp enough to steal her breath mid-sentence. She gripped the edge of the presentation remote, forced herself to continue. "We eliminate redundant infrastructure and..." The room tilted. Betty blinked hard, trying to focus on the numbers dancing across the screen, but her body had finally reached the limit of what pride and painkillers could sustain. She felt something warm and wet spreading across her abdomen, knew with clinical detachment that something internal had finally torn, that the price of 4 days of silence was being collected in real time. "Ms. Brown," someone asked. Gerald from HR, his voice coming from very far away. Betty tried to respond, but her knees unlocked, and the world became a spiral of marble floor and fluorescent lights, and the distant awareness that she was falling. That after 4 days of refusing to break, she was shattering in front of everyone who'd ever doubted she belonged. She never hit the floor. Hands caught her, tattooed and impossibly strong, belonging to someone who'd moved with the kind of speed that suggested he'd been watching her long before she'd started falling. Tain Chen, the Dragon of Wall Street, the man who sat at the head of every board meeting but rarely spoke, cradled Betty against his chest with a gentleness that contradicted everything she knew about him. "Meeting adjourned," Tain said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made 16 executives scramble for the exits without question. "Someone call my private physician, now." His fingers found the tear in her blouse, the blood seeping through layers of professional armor. Betty watched his expression shift from concern to something colder, something that looked like fury carved from ice. When he looked up, his gaze locked onto Marcus Sterling, who'd frozen halfway to the door. "You," Tain said, and that single word carried enough menace to make Marcus's face drain of color. "Stay exactly where you are. We're going to have a very thorough conversation about how one of my strategists ended up bleeding in my boardroom." Betty's vision finally surrendered to darkness, but not before she heard Marcus Sterling start to stammer an excuse that died the moment Tain Chen's tattooed hand tightened protectively around her. Betty woke to the kind of silence that only existed in spaces insulated by obscene wealth. No traffic sounds, no fluorescent hum, just the soft beep of medical equipment and the scent of jasmine mixed with antiseptic. The ceiling above her was coffered mahogany, hand-carved with dragons that seemed to move in the low amber lighting. This wasn't a hospital. Hospitals didn't have silk sheets or IV stands that looked like they belonged in a museum. She tried to sit up and discovered 2 things simultaneously. First, her ribs had been professionally wrapped, the pain reduced to a dull ache that suggested serious pharmaceutical intervention. Second, she wasn't alone. Tain Chen sat in a leather chair beside the bed, his burgundy suit jacket discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled to reveal forearms covered in traditional Chinese tattoos that writhed with dragons and peonies and characters she couldn't read. He'd been watching her sleep with the patience of a predator who knew the prey couldn't escape. "Don't move too quickly," he said, his voice carrying the kind of educated precision that came from international boarding schools and Ivy League MBAs. "You had internal bleeding. My physician repaired a lacerated spleen and 3 cracked ribs. You're lucky you didn't hemorrhage in that boardroom." Betty's throat was dry, her voice emerging as gravel. "Where am I?" "The medical suite of my penthouse. You've been unconscious for 6 hours." Tain leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and protected. "The doctor says your injuries are 4 days old. You've been working with a torn spleen and cracked ribs for 4 days. Do you have any idea how close you came to dying on my conference table?" "I needed to finish the presentation." The excuse sounded hollow even to her own ears. "The Meridian acquisition," Tain's laugh was bitter. "You were willing to bleed out for a $50 million deal when you're worth 10 times that to this company." He stood, moving to the window that overlooked Manhattan glittering like a circuit board. "I've watched you for 8 months, Betty Brown. Watched you turn impossible negotiations into victories. Watched you work harder than any 3 executives combined. Watched you make this company a fortune, while they treated you like you should be grateful for the opportunity to be exploited." Betty's pulse quickened. "You've been watching me." "I watch everything that happens in my house." He turned back to her, and the expression on his face was something between fury and possession. "Which is why I need you to tell me the name of the man who put his hands on what belongs under my roof. Because your clothes were torn, Betty. Your injuries weren't from a fall or an accident. Someone beat you, and you chose to nearly die rather than report it. The air in the room felt suddenly thick. Betty understood with crystalline clarity that her answer would determine whether someone lived or disappeared. Tain Chen wasn't asking as a concerned employer. He was asking as the dragon of Wall Street, as the head of an empire where loyalty was rewarded and betrayal was erased. "Marcus Sterling," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was unleashing. "Head of operations, 4 days ago in the emergency stairwell." Tain's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness became absolutely lethal. "Thank you for your honesty." He pulled out his phone, typed a single message. "Mr. Sterling's employment has just been permanently terminated, along with several other things." Tain Chen had built an empire on the principle that mercy was a luxury reserved for the innocent. Marcus Sterling and everyone who'd protected him had exhausted their claim to innocence the moment Betty Brown collapsed bleeding in his boardroom. What followed wasn't corporate discipline. It was surgical annihilation. Marcus Sterling's unraveling began at 3 a.m. when federal agents raided his brownstone in Brooklyn Heights with a warrant for securities fraud. The evidence was impeccable because Tain's people had spent 6 hours manufacturing a paper trail that would take prosecutors years to unravel, by which time it wouldn't matter. Marcus's assets were frozen by dawn. His wife filed for divorce by noon. Her attorney, armed with documentation of affairs Marcus didn't remember having with women who swore under oath they'd never forget him. By evening, his uncle, the board member who'd made him untouchable, resigned from Chen Holdings citing health concerns, though the real concern was the photographs delivered to his home showing transactions that would interest the IRS and several international law enforcement agencies. Gerald from HR received a different kind of attention. His termination was immediate and public, announced in a company-wide email that detailed a pattern of dismissed complaints and protected predators. Tain personally ensured that every recruiter and HR professional in Manhattan knew Gerald's name and his legacy of institutional betrayal. The man would never work in corporate America again, which was generous compared to what Tain's instincts demanded. But Sterling himself received the dragon's full attention. The federal charges were just the opening act. Tain's triad connections moved through Sterling's life like acid through tissue. His legal defense fund evaporated when his family's law firms suddenly discovered conflicts of interest that made representation impossible. His professional reputation dissolved as former colleagues received anonymous tips about falsified reports and embezzled funds. His social standing crumbled when every club, every society, every institution that had welcomed him suddenly found reasons to revoke his membership. By the end of the first week, Marcus Sterling was unemployed, divorced, under federal investigation, and living in a studio apartment in Queens that Tain's people had helpfully arranged, in a building controlled by associates who ensured Sterling understood exactly whose mercy he now depended on. The man who'd beaten Betty in a stairwell now flinched at shadows and slept with his lights on, waiting for the other shoe to drop, never quite sure if the dragon of Wall Street had finished with him or was simply savoring the long game. Tain watched it all unfold from his penthouse office, reviewing reports with the same clinical precision Betty applied to financial models. But he took no pleasure in the destruction, only the grim satisfaction of accounts balanced. The message had been sent throughout Chen Holdings and beyond. Touch what was his, harm what he valued, and discover that wealth and connections meant nothing against a man who controlled the invisible architecture of power itself. 3 board members who'd known about Sterling's behavior and done nothing received private visits from associates who explained, very courteously, that their retirements would be immediate and their silence absolute. They took the offer. Men who'd sat in boardrooms making millions understood predatory calculation when they saw it, recognized that Tain Chen had simply decided they were liabilities, and liabilities in his world had a very short shelf life. Betty Brown slept in his medical suite, healing under his protection, while Tain dismantled the entire system that had failed her. It wasn't justice. Justice was a performance for people who believed in rules. This was something older, something that flowed in his blood and carved in his bones. This was war, and Tane Chen had never lost one. Betty spent 2 weeks recovering in Tane's penthouse, and in that time she learned that monsters were more complicated than the stories suggested. The man who'd systematically destroyed Marcus Sterling's existence also brought her jasmine tea every morning at precisely 7 a.m., brewed according to a recipe his grandmother had taught him in Shanghai. The Dragon of Wall Street, who made federal agents dance to his invisible strings, spent his evenings reading Confucian philosophy and arguing with her about whether true power came from fear or respect. "Fear is immediate," Tane said one night, sitting in the chair beside her bed while rain drummed against floor-to-ceiling windows. "But respect is sustainable. Fear makes people obedient. Respect makes them loyal." "And which do you prefer?" Betty asked, watching him over the rim of her teacup. She was strong enough now to sit up without wincing, strong enough to recognize that these conversations weren't accidental. Tane was letting her see behind the mask, and she wasn't sure if that was generosity or strategy. "I prefer competence," he replied, a slight smile touching his lips. "Loyalty and obedience are worthless without the ability to execute. That's why I watched you for 8 months before you collapsed. You're not just brilliant, Betty. You're incorruptible. You understand leverage but refuse to abuse it. You navigate systems designed to break you and somehow emerge sharper." She'd watched him work during her recovery, observed the way he moved between worlds with the fluidity of someone who'd been code-switching since childhood. In the morning, he conducted conference calls in Mandarin with associates in Hong Kong, his voice carrying the kind of authority that needed no translation. By afternoon, he met with Manhattan's financial elite in perfect English, playing the role of legitimate billionaire so convincingly that Betty almost forgot the tattooed hands making merger decisions had also signed execution orders. By evening, he transformed again, shedding the corporate armor to become something quieter, more contemplative, the man who told her stories about his father's restaurant in Chinatown and the decision to build an empire that could never be taken away. The tenderness surprised her most. The way he personally changed her bandages with a surgeon's precision, his touch clinical but somehow protective. The way he noticed when she struggled with nightmares and appeared with warm milk and conversation until the fear passed. The way he never touched her beyond what healing required, maintaining a distance that felt like respect rather than disinterest. He could have demanded anything. She was recovering in his home, dependent on his protection, vulnerable in ways that men like Marcus Sterling would have exploited. But Tane simply waited, reading his philosophy, building his empire, treating her like something valuable that required careful handling. "Why are you doing this?" Betty asked one evening when the silence between them felt comfortable rather than tense. "The medical care I understand, but the conversations, the time you spend here instead of running your empire, why?" Tane closed his book, the leather binding embossed with characters she now recognized as Sun Tzu. "Because I'm tired of being surrounded by people who fear me too much to tell me the truth. You nearly died rather than ask for help, which makes you either incredibly foolish or incredibly strong. I suspect both." He met her eyes, and the intensity there made her breath catch. "I want to know which quality dominates. And I want to know if a woman who refuses to break under torture might be strong enough to stand beside a dragon." Betty understood then that she wasn't just recovering from Marcus Sterling's violence. She was being evaluated for something far more dangerous than a corporate position. Tane Chen was offering her a choice that couldn't be unmade, and the man behind the mask was giving her time to decide if she wanted to see what happened when the mask came off completely. Betty was strong enough to walk the perimeter of Tane's penthouse by the 3rd week, her body healing with the kind of efficiency that came from excellent medical care and the absence of trauma. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, watching the city glitter like a promise or a threat depending on your perspective. Behind her, she heard Tane enter the room with the quiet precision that suggested he'd been trained to move without sound long before he became a billionaire. "The doctor cleared you this morning," he said, joining her at the window. "Physically, you're ready to return to your life. Your apartment, your routines, your career at Chen Holdings if you choose to continue in your previous role." Betty heard the unspoken words in that statement, "if you choose," as if there were other options she hadn't yet considered. And if I don't choose my previous role? Tane smiled, the expression transforming his face from dangerous to something almost beautiful. Then we have a conversation I've been planning for 3 weeks. He gestured to the leather chairs positioned near the window. Sit with me. What I'm about to offer requires you to be comfortable, because I need you thinking clearly, not distracted by polite standing. She sat, curiosity overriding caution. Tane settled into the chair across from her, his posture relaxed but his attention absolute. He discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled to reveal the tattoos that marked him as something more than corporate elite. A dragon coiled up his right forearm, its eyes seeming to track her movements. I told you I watched you for 8 months, Tane began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. But I didn't explain why. Chen Holdings employs 3,000 people across 6 divisions. I know perhaps 24 by name, maybe 50 by reputation. You, Betty Brown, I know by the elegance of your financial models, by the way you negotiate as if you're playing chess while everyone else plays checkers, by the fact that you turned a failing acquisition into an $80 million profit because you saw patterns no one else recognized. I was doing my job, Betty said, though her pulse had quickened. You were building an empire without realizing it. Tane leaned forward, his intensity focused entirely on her. I don't need another employee, Betty. I have thousands. I don't need another executive. I have dozens who execute my vision adequately. What I need, what I've been searching for, is a partner who understands that legitimate business and underground power aren't separate worlds but interlocking systems. Someone brilliant enough to navigate both. Someone incorruptible enough to be trusted with absolute authority. Someone strong enough to stand beside a dragon without being consumed. Betty's breath caught. You're offering me a partnership. I'm offering you a throne. Tane's words hung in the air like a verdict. Director of Strategic Operations with full executive authority. Equal access to both my legitimate holdings and my triad connections. You'll reshape Chen Holdings into whatever you envision, with my resources and protection behind every decision. You'll attend meetings where billion-dollar deals are decided and meetings where traders are judged. You'll be feared, respected, and untouchable. Why me? Because you already paid the blood price, Tane said simply. You survived what should have broken you, refused to compromise your principles even when silence seemed safer, and proved you'd rather die than submit to corruption. Those aren't employee qualities, Betty. Those are queen qualities. I'm not looking for someone to serve my empire. I'm looking for someone to rule it with me. Betty stared at the man who destroyed her abuser, protected her recovery, and now offered her everything she'd fought for plus the dangerous power she'd never imagined wanting. The choice was impossible and inevitable. Stay safe in the shadows, or step into the darkness beside the dragon and claim the throne she'd built without knowing it existed. I accept, she said, and watched Tane Chen smile like she'd just declared war on the world. Betty's return to Chen Holdings was announced with the kind of corporate precision that left no room for misinterpretation. A company-wide email from Tane Chen himself, brief and absolute. Betty Brown has been promoted to Director of Strategic Operations, effective immediately. She reports directly to me and holds full executive authority over all divisions. Her decisions are final. No explanation of her 3-week absence. No mention of Marcus Sterling's spectacular implosion. Just the declaration that the woman who'd collapsed bleeding in the boardroom now controlled the empire. She walked into the building on a Monday morning wearing a black suit tailored to perfection, her locks styled in a crown that added 2 inches to her authority, her heels clicking against marble like a countdown. The lobby went silent. Security guards who'd barely noticed her for 3 years now straightened at attention. Executives who dismissed her as just an analyst suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. The message was clear before she'd spoken a single word. The woman who'd survived Marcus Sterling and earned the dragon's protection was not someone you wanted as an enemy. Her new office occupied the 50th floor, 3 doors down from Tane's, with windows overlooking the city and furniture that cost more than her former annual salary. But Betty didn't spend the first day admiring the view. She spent it systematically reviewing every HR complaint filed in the past 5 years, cross-referencing them against personnel records, building a database of patterns that previous leadership had deliberately ignored. By noon, she'd identified 17 employees with documented histories of harassment, discrimination, or abuse that had been buried through connections or convenient resignations. By end of business, all 17 received termination notices. No severance packages, no letters of recommendation, just security escorts to collect their belongings and NDAs that promised legal annihilation if they spoke publicly about their dismissals. 3 were senior vice presidents. 2 had family connections to the board. None of it mattered. Betty had Tane's absolute backing, and everyone in Chen Holdings understood that challenging her decisions meant challenging the dragon himself. The policy she implemented was elegantly brutal: zero tolerance, immediate investigation, and consequences that scaled with severity. Inappropriate comments earned written warnings and mandatory training. Unwanted physical contact meant suspension without pay. Assault, harassment, or abuse of power triggered instant termination, plus strategic destruction of professional reputation. Betty personally oversaw every case. Her financial analyst's precision now applied to dismantling the architecture of institutional protection that had nearly killed her. "You're terrifying them," Tane observed one evening, reviewing her week's work from the doorway of her office. He looked pleased rather than concerned. "Good," Betty replied, not looking up from the compliance report she was annotating. "Fear keeps the predators careful, but I'm also promoting 4 women and 2 men who have been systematically passed over despite exceptional performance. Fear without opportunity just builds resentment. I want loyalty earned through fairness, backed by the certainty that crossing me ends careers." "Respect and fear," Tane said, echoing their earlier conversation. "You're learning quickly." "I'm learning from the best." Betty finally looked up, meeting his eyes. "Though I'm adding my own amendments. Your empire runs on controlled violence. I'm making sure it also runs on merit. The people who survive in this new order will deserve their positions." Tane smiled, the expression carrying pride and something darker. "My queen is reshaping the kingdom, exactly as I hoped." He stepped into her office, closing the door behind him. "The board meets tomorrow. Some of them are nervous about your methods. I thought you might enjoy explaining your philosophy personally." Betty stood, smoothing her suit, feeling the weight of authority she'd earned through blood and survival. "I'd be delighted to educate them on why the old order is extinct. Anyone who doesn't adapt becomes an example." She'd collapsed wounded in a meeting 3 weeks ago. Tomorrow, she'd make grown men understand that the woman who survived was far more dangerous than the one who'd fallen. 6 months after Betty Brown collapsed in the boardroom, she stood on the balcony of Tane Chen's penthouse overlooking Manhattan at twilight. The city sprawled beneath them like a kingdom won through blood and strategy, every lit window a testament to empires built on ambition and ruthlessness. She wore a black silk dress that cost more than her first year's salary at Chen Holdings, her locks flowing free, a glass of vintage wine in her hand that she barely tasted. Power, she'd learned, was intoxicating enough without alcohol. Tane joined her at the railing, his presence as familiar now as her own heartbeat. 6 months of ruling beside him had taught her the rhythm of his silences, the meaning behind his rare smiles, the calculations that happened behind those dark eyes that saw 3 moves ahead of everyone else. They transformed Chen Holdings into something unprecedented, a corporate empire where merit was rewarded with the same precision that betrayal was punished, where women no longer whispered about harassment in bathrooms because predators had learned that Betty Brown's justice was absolute and Tane Chen's backing was eternal. "The quarterly reports came in," Tane said, his voice carrying satisfaction. "Revenue up 34%, employee retention at an all-time high, and 3 Fortune 500 companies trying to poach you with offers that would make most executives sell their souls." "And I declined all 3 without hesitation," Betty replied, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of amber and blood. "Because they're offering me positions I already hold. Why would I trade a throne for a chair at someone else's table?" Tane moved closer, his hand finding hers on the railing, their fingers interlocking with the ease of a gesture performed 1,000 times. Do you remember what you said the night Marcus Sterling cornered you in that stairwell, when he told you that talent without protection was a liability? I remember everything about that night. Betty's voice remained steady, though the memory still carried edges sharp enough to cut. I told him I'd rely on my talent, that I didn't need his protection or his connections. You were right and wrong, Tane said, turning to face her fully. Your talent was always sufficient, but talent alone shouldn't require you to nearly die proving it. Protection shouldn't be contingent on sexual favors or family connections. You deserved both from the moment you walked into this building 3 years ago. Betty met his eyes, seeing the man who'd caught her when she fell, destroyed her enemies, and offered her power without demanding submission in return. I used to think my collapse was my greatest failure, the moment I proved every doubt about my weakness right. And now I understand it was the foundation. Betty squeezed his hand, feeling the strength in those tattooed fingers that had signed execution orders and changed her bandages with equal precision. I didn't break in that boardroom. I broke through the glass ceiling, through the illusion that silence was survival, through the system designed to make women like me invisible. I fell so I could rise as something they'd never seen before. A phoenix, Tane said softly, his other hand coming up to cup her face with unexpected tenderness. Fire made flesh. And you're the dragon who gave that fire room to burn. Betty leaned into his touch, this man who was feared by thousands but gentle with her in ways that contradicted everything people believed about monsters. We're dangerous together. We're unstoppable together, Tane corrected. Which is why every empire that matters watches Chen Holdings now, wondering how a black woman who nearly died became the most powerful executive on the eastern seaboard, and how the Dragon of Wall Street finally found someone worthy of standing in his shadow. I don't stand in your shadow, Betty said, smiling with the confidence of someone who'd earned every inch of her authority. I stand beside it, casting my own. Tane pulled her close, his lips brushing her forehead in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. The phoenix and the dragon, they'll write legends about what we've built, about the woman who refused to break and the man who went to war for her justice. Betty looked out over the city they ruled together, remembering the woman who'd hidden her wounds under concealer and painkillers, believing that survival meant silence. That woman was gone, burned away in the collapse that everyone thought was an ending. What rose from those ashes was something infinitely more dangerous. A queen who understood that true power came not from enduring abuse in silence, but from refusing to accept a world where abuse went unpunished. Let them write their legends, Betty said, her voice carrying across the balcony like a promise and a threat. We'll be too busy building our empire to care about their stories. Tane's laugh was warm against her hair, the sound of a dragon content with his treasure. Below them, Manhattan glittered with possibility and danger, a city that bowed to those strong enough to claim it. And on the 58th floor, a phoenix and a dragon stood together, their shared throne built on the ruins of everything that had tried to destroy them both.